And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
People's Dispatch reports Lai Ching-te's victory in Taiwanese presidential election tempered by parliamentary loss. In a divided mandate, Lai Ching-te of the Democratic Progressive Party won the presidency in the island territory with less than half the votes, while his party lost its parliamentary majority. What signals does this send, and what's the longer-term projection? For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled I Dare Say, A Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the People's Dispatch continues, the general victory nevertheless was tempered by a divided mandate. Even though Lai broke the nearly three-decade trend of the presidency swinging between the DPP and the KMT, he did not command the majority of the popular votes. So, Dr. Horne, what does this tell us about U.S. influence on the election, and what can we take away from this as we try to figure out how to proceed in going forward?
Well, I regret having to break this to your audience, but we may be on the verge of World War III. This is not only bad news, it's even bad news for those who would like to profit by investing in the stocks of the military-industrial complex, because they may not be around to enjoy their profit-mongering. The question is, how did we get here? Well, for convenience sake, let's start with what happened a half century ago when Henry Kissinger and President Nixon brokered an anti-Soviet accord with the People's Republic of China. That is to say that in return for turning against its erstwhile communist ally in Moscow, China received massive foreign direct investment from U.S. corporations, creating this juggernaut to the point now where China is in the passing lane, number one economy soon, if not already, if you look at the metric of purchasing power parity. And this has U.S. imperialism quite upset because it not only casts a shadow over the future of capitalism, it casts a shadow over the future of white supremacy as well. Now, if you look at the two major parties, you see that the Democratic Party is in a classic bind, a classic conundrum of imperial overstretch. That is to say, they're seeking to target Russia through this escapade in Ukraine. They're confronting Iran as we speak, exchanging missile shots with the Islamic Republic. And of course, they still have China in the crosshairs. If you look at Mr. Trump and the GOP, and certainly in light of his apparent victory in the Iowa caucus last night, we can fairly project, barring some unforeseen circumstance, that he will be the Republican nominee by November 2024. He obviously wants to cut a deal with Russia. He is not opposed to weakening NATO. In fact, you may recall that his former national security advisor, John Bolton, said in his memoir that Mr. Trump saw the European Union, a complementary organization to NATO, as being number two on his hit list after the People's Republic of China. That is to say, Mr. Trump would like to focus on China with a laser-like emphasis and stress, and he may even want to focus on Iran as well, although he may have an excuse for not doing so, since he's upset with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, because Netanyahu in November 2020 sent a congratulatory message to Mr. Biden, and Mr. Trump felt that after all the water he had carried for Israel, including moving the embassy to Jerusalem, he should have gotten more respect. And so his subjectivity might lead him to try to punish Mr. Netanyahu, assuming that he's still in office by 2024, 2025. The question is, will the U.S. allies follow after Washington? And that is unclear. And that will help to determine, to a degree, only to a degree, if we will be faced with World War III. Now, if you look at the locomotive of the European Union, speaking of the Federal Republic of Germany, its economy is shrinking. It's now the sick man of Europe. This is due in no small measure to tailing after U.S. imperialism, which is not surprising given that Germany is still an occupied country, occupied by U.S. imperialism, and still has to dance to the tune of Uncle Sam. But Germany is trapped because, on the one hand, it is an occupied country. On the other hand, it sees the way out for its economy as aligned with the economy of the People's Republic of China. But there hangs a tail because the People's Republic of China is now eating the lunch of the major German export engines. Speaking of the automotive sector, China is now the leading automotive exporter, believe it or not, on planet Earth, which is due in no small measure to the fact that as a result of this Ukraine misadventure, Russia has reoriented its economy towards China. They're now dealing about $200 billion annually in trade, by the way, not in dollars, in the ruble and in the renminbi. And this is obviously jeopardizing the fortunes of BMW and Mercedes-Benz and Volkswagen and all the rest. The Ukraine escapade, once again, upset the complementarity between the Russian and German economies to the detriment of Berlin. And you see France in a similar position. On the one hand, it needs the Chinese economy to drag its economy out of the ditch. On the other hand, it relies upon U.S. imperialism as the ultimate guarantor of world imperialism, not least in its neo-empire in Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger and Guinea-Conakry. So it too is trapped. Even the United States is trapped because it relies upon the People's Bank buying U.S. paper, keeping the U.S. government afloat. And keep in mind, we cannot rule out the fact that the U.S. government may be shut down sooner rather than later. For how long is unclear. But it needs the Chinese economy. At the same time, China is presenting a stiff and stern challenge to U.S. imperial hegemony. You see this dilemma in the fortunes of Tesla, led by the South African-born, apartheid-born billionaire Elon Musk, which manufactures heavily in China. But at the same time, Tesla is being challenged by BYD of Beijing, which, by the way, is backed by the U.S. billionaire Warren Buffett, which has led to an increasing level of insult exchange between the two billionaires, speaking of Warren Buffett and Elon Musk. And we need to keep a focus on that in terms of these inter-imperialist contradictions that are sure to arise. And if you look at Microsoft, which has now passed Apple as being the most valuable U.S. corporation, perhaps the most valuable global corporation, it's heavily dependent in terms of its fortunes in artificial intelligence on its laboratory in China. Microsoft may have to take a haircut, may have to shut down that lab as a result of having to get in sync with the dictates of U.S. imperialism. And if you look at Apple, it's seeking to forestall taking a haircut by moving production increasingly to India. But the problem with India is that it does not have the infrastructure in terms of electricity and airports and highways that China has developed over the decades thanks to U.S. imperialism. If you look at Japan, it too is trapped. It relies heavily upon the Chinese economy, like its other members of the so-called G7, but it fears the People's Republic of China, fearing that China still is bent upon revenge because of the depredations inflicted upon China by the imperial army during World War II, leading to the massacres of millions. And recall as well that China exacted a certain kind of revenge as recently as 1985, when it joined with the United States and its North Atlantic allies in the so-called Plaza Accord, which strengthened the Japanese currency, leading to lost decades for the Japanese economy, from which it has barely recovered to this very day. And of course, Japan is heavily connected to Taiwan. Recall that it was Japan that colonized Taiwan during the middle of the so-called century of humiliation from the 1840s to 1949 with the triumph of the communists. That is to say, it colonized Taiwan in 1895. And a number of key Taiwanese leaders over the years have not only been close to Japan, they've even spoken Japanese. I'm speaking of Lee Dong-hui, the president from 1988 to 2000, for example. The Philippines, of course, a former U.S. colony, is tailing after U.S. imperialism and sees itself as sort of being at the point of the spear, the tip of the spear with regard to attacking China. But this will not end well, I'm afraid to say. And then you have the U.S. leadership, which has been quite provocative in this regard. Recall what Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker, did when she traveled provocatively to China circa 2022, accompanied by Gregory Meeks, the leading member of the Congressional Black Caucus from Southeast Queens. Recall the so-called verbal miscues of Mr. Biden, who has suggested that U.S. imperialism would come to the defense of Taiwan if it sought independence. So the only possible beneficiary of this current crisis would be those who invest in the U.S. military-industrial complex, including Boeing, by the way, which is too strapped because on the one hand, it wants to outfit the U.S. military. On the other hand, it wants to sell civilian aircraft to China. But investors in Raytheon and Lockheed and Boeing may not be around to enjoy their ill-gotten gains if World War III erupts.
Dr. Horne, what about the thought that China has some time on their hands? They're looking at the U.S. and this, calamitous policies in the Middle East, and they can kind of stand on the sidelines and watch the U.S. collapse. We got about 2 minutes. Your thoughts on that?
Well, that's possibly going into the thinking in the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party. But keep in mind, if you turn that coin over, U.S. imperialism may decide upon a riverboat gamble. That is to say, it may be collapsing, but it may be able to rescue its moth-eaten project by launching a preemptive strike against China, basically overthrowing the Communist Party, just like it was essential to undermining the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So I don't think that China necessarily is going to sit on its hands and await the inevitable collapse of U.S. imperialism, as alluring as that prospect might be.
And as we get out, we have just about 2 minutes. RT has appeased the people of Taiwan, don't want war with Beijing, so why did they elect a pro-independence president? The outcome is certainly a boon for the U.S., allowing it to continue its campaign of pressure on China. Your thoughts?
Well, as you mentioned accurately in your setup introduction, the so-called pro-independence forces in the DPP lost their majority by quite a substantial measure in the parliament. And so that should be a restraining factor because recall that the major opposition, the so-called KMT, the so-called Chinese nationalists, some years ago, they decided to try to make a kind of peace with Beijing, and that is going to restrain the hotheads in Taiwan. I should also say that in my remarks, I should have mentioned the role of chip manufacturing, the fact that what goes into your smartphone and increasingly in automobiles are manufactured on this island off the southern coast of China, about 23 million strong. And even though the major chip manufacturer, TSMC, is busily building plants in Arizona and elsewhere in the United States, it's no secret that they feel that the United States is not up to the task of matching the efficiency and the production of Taiwanese chip manufacturing. So once again, U.S. imperialism is trapped with no way out, and buckle your seatbelts as a result.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.